Welcome back to Before the Whistle. I'm your host, Maddy Hudak, and for this episode, I thought it would be a good time to finally dive into some tangible on-field action rather than the hypotheticals, which I have enjoyed at this point in the offseason. But this last Saturday, rookie minicamp, I think pretty much for every team took place this weekend, but for the Saints, the open media portion was this Saturday. I didn't really know what I was going to do once I got there. It was my first year attending this part of the offseason rookie minicamp. I previously had only gone to training camp and games for the Saints, and I'm much more used to that on the college side of things. So I just figured go in, see what I can observe, probably pay attention to Nick Anderson, the former Tulane linebacker who signed as an undrafted rookie free agent with the Saints after this year's draft. And from what I could see on the field, it was everything that I've seen before from Nick, meaning that it doesn't surprise me that he already looked fluid and was already working in his good ball placement and eye tracking abilities in the drills that I saw him in. I figured maybe go on to the other side of the field. There's Ron Curry working out with the quarterback. So let's go see what's going on there. I'm walking down there and all of a sudden my eyes get drawn to one rookie, and really it proceeded to be the only player I paid attention to for the remainder of the open portion of that practice, which is rookie quarterback Jake Haener. So I know the Saints just did the most important thing that they needed to do this offseason in getting a quarterback, and they did so in Derek Carr. And all things considered, they're set up in a good position, looking at the division, looking at how he fits with the team, hearing of those comments about his ability to read defenses, set checks at the line of scrimmage, and be, I think, a little more active in the quarterback room with Pete Carmichael. They have all that in Derek Carr. And that's settled now for the next several years based on his contract, which is a 4-year deal that's worth $150 million. And I believe the first 2 years are $30 million each guaranteed. I'll admit that I am not the cap management person. For Saints people, I'd recommend Nick Underhill or Ross Jackson, but from what I do know, his base salary for 2023 and 2024 are guaranteed at his time of signing. And he has a guarantee in 2025 if he gets injured, and then an additional $10 million roster bonus if he's on the roster in March of 2024. And all things considered, things would have to go severely wrong from now until less than a year from now, next March. So it's not really even worth discussing. And it is a little weird to start off an episode saying, how do you get out of a contract? Because that's not what I'm trying to do here. And I'll be totally honest, I haven't had meaningful time to sit down and watch Derek Carr's film. I remember being impressed by him when I would watch him more often in the Bay Area. We get Raiders games that came on, and the times that he played the Saints a few years back. But there's something about seeing something with your eyes mere feet in front of you that just gives you this different type of feeling. And I felt it for the first time on the sideline at Tulane. Yes, you lose out on the aerial view of what all 22 essentially looks like in the press box, but there's just such a more visceral feeling, I think. And I said that it really applies to running backs, but I'm now starting to see that applies to quarterbacks as well, as I have seen now through 2 seasons of going to Mobile for the Senior Bowl and this last Saturday. So to get back to Derek Carr's contract, there's an out in 2026, but they could take the cap hit in 2025 if, again, things seriously go wrong, Derek Carr underperforms. And again, I don't expect that to happen. But Carr is still ultimately a Band-Aid, really, on a wound that New Orleans has largely ignored since signing number 9 in Drew Brees before the 2006 season. You know, they have tried now replacing Drew Brees a few times via these free agents, but while you'd want the player who's ranking now in the top 15 in quarterback contracts to lead the team to its first postseason berth since Drew Brees retired, there's equal chance that this doesn't work out. It's the same thing with free agency signings at quarterback and drafting quarterbacks. But every once in a while, you got to get your hands dirty and get your feet wet and get some guys to develop in that draft room. You know, after they signed Drew Brees in 2006, the Saints didn't even bother drafting a quarterback until 2010, and that was a 7th rounder named Sean Canfield, who never took an NFL snap. And they didn't try again for 5 more years until 2015, when they took Garrett Grayson in the 3rd round, who never made it out of the preseason. Then Tommy Stevens was a 7th round pick in 2020. And really, that was nothing more than a move to spite the Carolina Panthers, who intended on taking him. And obviously, there was no meaningful development to be had there. And then finally, the 4th quarterback drafted since the Saints signed Drew Brees was Ian Book back in 2021. And as much criticism as that got at the time, especially when we keep talking about the Senior Bowl, Ian Book's performance there largely wasn't in the air, and it was him just kind of scrambling around in circles. But there wasn't anything wrong with that choice. And quite frankly, leaving that draft without a quarterback would be borderline malpractice for a team whose franchise quarterback for the last 15 seasons just retired, and they really have no one lined up there to replace him. You know, when the Saints hosted the Chargers back in the 2020 season, we all kind of had a feeling that it was probably Drew Brees' final year. And I was sitting there realizing this is probably the last time he's going to face his first team that drafted him, who, yes, he had an injury that led to him being signed by the Saints, but they also drafted Phillip Rivers. And then they also pushed out Phillip Rivers for Justin Herbert. As Bill Walsh once said quite famously, and where I'm kind of going with this, it's better to get rid of a player a year early rather than a year too late. And that really applies most to the most important position on the field, which is quarterback. And yes, there's more emotions involved at that role. And they are the ones that win and lose the big games. And if you win a lot of big games, it's a little harder to let go of that feeling. But you run the risk of a decline, of not having someone lined up to take the reins when either an untimely injury happens or they just decide to hang it up for one reason or the other. But you also lose out, I think, on this mentoring opportunity to develop an heir apparent while that franchise quarterback is still there. As much as we'd like to think these guys are idols and irreplaceable and eternal, nostalgia is just not going to win you a Super Bowl. So back in 2020, it felt like the appropriate time to consider what was a difficult question in, was it the right choice to extend Drew Brees and let him retire on his own terms with the Saints? And here I am actually inclined to say yes, because I think the Saints are a very unique case where the symbiotic relationship of a player that healed from injury and healed a city that was absolutely decimated from tragedy alongside it and brought them their first Super Bowl appearance and win in franchise history. Yeah, you are probably the exception to the rule. But just because you're letting someone retire on their own terms doesn't mean that there shouldn't be a plan for, again, when that day finally comes, because what could have been done was a lot more than 3 total draft picks that were invested in the most important position on the field before Brees took his final NFL snap, because Ian Book doesn't count after the fact that Drew Brees had already retired. And I had looked at, it was a 3-part series, and I started with teams that followed what Bill Walsh said to do and kicked the player out the door, to put it in unkind words. The Packers are probably the paramount example of that sentiment, and they continue to do so. The jury's still out on Jordan Love, but it was arguably time to move on from Aaron Rodgers, especially given how that relationship started to go, because a lot of this complicated process is balancing relationships and balancing egos, and it's easier said than done. Ryan Tannehill got all this flack for saying that he didn't intend to mentor Malik Willis to take over his job last season, but can you blame him? And Drew Brees and Ryan Tannehill aren't necessarily in the same conversation. You could argue that Aaron Rodgers probably could have been less bothered by it as well, but it was understandable considering their championship window was still in place, and he at the time wanted weapons, and instead they traded up to draft a quarterback. But it did the same thing to the guy whose place he took in Brett Favre, and he still had several seasons left in him, including that NFC Championship appearance led by Brett Favre and the Vikings that sent the Saints to Miami for that Super Bowl win. And he had a rough first year, Aaron Rodgers as a starter for Green Bay, but it wasn't really his fault. It was more injuries on defense and just situational factors. But he led him to a wild card berth next year with an 11-5 record. And the following season, they became one of 10 teams at that point that had made the Super Bowl with a wild card playoff spot. And he ultimately became the MVP, and they beat the Pittsburgh Steelers. And then they went on something like a 6-year consecutive postseason run, had a 2-year drought. And then, except for last season, the last 3 years, the Packers have gone pretty far in the playoffs, although they cannot seem to beat the Niners in the championship game. That's another story, but that's at this point decades of setup success. The only thing that you could argue is they probably should have pushed Aaron Rodgers out a year early, just when you look at the value of a first-round rookie quarterback's contract, 5th-year option, and the like. But all things considered, they have continued to show that that model probably is one that most teams should be following. And then you look at Joe Montana, and you think, who would ever push out Joe Montana? Well, the 49ers did when Steve Young presented them with his own ultimatum of start me or trade me. They went with Young, and Montana asked to be traded. And he brought Kansas City their first divisional playoff win in 22 years after having just one playoff game appearance, one win from 1972 to 1991 prior to that. And then meanwhile, Young led San Francisco to the NFC Championship game his first year, and much like Aaron Rodgers, became the MVP and won the Super Bowl the following season, and they never missed the playoffs with Steve Young under center. And then you look at the Colts. I mean, if Peyton Manning can be forced out of the team that he led to 11 playoff appearances, 8 division titles, 2 Super Bowl appearances, including 1 win, no player is untouchable to me. And really, we shouldn't be saying that at all when we're talking about players in the NFL, and especially not quarterbacks. And then you look at the other side of the coin, and the pathway that New Orleans, up until arguably now, had been going down. Letting a player stay and retire on their own terms, but also not really cultivating a successor in the meantime. So you look at the Denver Broncos, who literally flailed in wasteland after John Elway retired for 14 years until they signed Peyton Manning in free agency. And they had no successor lined up. It was the same thing in Pittsburgh with Terry Bradshaw, who retired in 1983 after, I believe it was a botched Tommy John surgery. And then they flailed until they drafted Ben Roethlisberger, again, decades after the fact. Buffalo didn't make the postseason for 17 years until Josh Allen came along after Jim Kelly retired in 1996 because the team pushed him out. But not on his own terms and not really with a successor in place. So everything has to really work here. I brought up teams where this has worked, where you push out a quarterback early. They've all had a very qualified replacement lined up and primed to start that ultimately pushed out that aging star more than that star wanted to leave on their own terms. Aaron Rodgers had 3 years to sit on the bench, learn and develop, and he was ready to start. And it was time for Brett Favre to go as a result. And yeah, Young might have assumed the reins regardless, or he is the one that gets traded instead of Joe Montana, but that substantial time allowing him to develop in somewhat of a 2-quarterback system at times led him straight to an MVP season. I guess you could say the Colts got lucky with Andrew Luck, but unlucky really when you consider what happened to him. But I don't think that it was a surprise that Luck ended up being the player that he was. It doesn't feel like there's been as sure of a player, though, at that number 1 place since Andrew Luck. I've seen Joe Burrow and Trevor Lawrence, but I get that it's easier said than done. Trust me. But then you look at what happened when Andrew Luck abruptly retired and they had nothing going on there. And obviously that's an exception to a rule. But rather than retain this faith in their aging star, who, yes, brought their franchise unprecedented great success, who we watched go down a slope very abruptly when he got a neck injury in Peyton Manning, then it's time to take the emotions out of a sport that, ironically, I've been arguing how much they are important to, but I say that it's all about human beings and relationships at this sport, and quarterback is without question the most complicated relationship between a front office, a head coach, and that quarterback room, because unless you're Tom Brady and the like, you do kind of have to think that they're always looking over their shoulder, and there are more Ryan Tannehills than they are Drew Breeses out there in terms of job security or feeling that way. And again, that's not to say there's anything wrong with letting a quarterback play out their final years, but you have to have a contingency plan. And it wasn't like these teams that I brought up. I said Andrew Luck. That's an example of life happens. You really can't plan for an unexpected retirement press conference in the middle of the preseason. But when you fly out, it was either their owner or their GM or their head coach, someone with decision-making power for the Broncos, to convince John Elway to come back for one more year. Don't you think that what should have been first on your list was figuring out what after that? And then in the Steelers' case, Dan Marino was available in that 1983 draft. And the reason they passed on him was because they thought they had one good year left in Terry Bradshaw. I mean, even if you had 3 good years left in Terry Bradshaw, you still don't skip over Dan Marino because of that being the reason. It would be different if they just didn't like Dan Marino, but that's probably not the best evaluation to use as an example because everyone missed on that. That's for another day. But it's fair enough to say that you have to really be gentle with that transition process. And Buffalo, in contrast, was not. Like, they almost kind of fall in the middle where, yeah, they tried to draft a successor in Todd Collins to replace Jim Kelly, but they made the mistake of telling Jim Kelly this and not really having their finger on the pulse on what kind of relationship they had going on there. So, and ironically, he cited what happened to Joe Montana. Jim Kelly abruptly retired, and then they threw Todd Collins to the Wolves because he was meant to be a developmental draft pick that was supposed to have a few years to learn behind Jim Kelly. But something went wrong there in the relationship process. And you're always going to run that risk when you draft a successor, that they're going to want out, or they're really not going to mentor that young player. Like, you didn't really hear much about Aaron Rodgers' relationship with Jordan Love, but it wasn't like he really got much mentoring from Brett Favre either. So it's a weird situation. And now we've entered this weird NBA type era of free agency shopping for quarterbacks as an alternative to continuously drafting them. It's not just, oh, we have a top 10 pick, it's time to get a quarterback. You should be consistently trying to improve that position as an NFL team. It doesn't really help, though, that the first case of this new age of trading for a starting quarterback was Tom Brady, of all people, who then goes and wins a Super Bowl in his first season with his new team. And then Matt Stafford follows him up and does the same thing with the Rams. So, yeah, it does make it a little hard to argue against that. And the proof is clearly in the pudding for 2 of those cases. But what now? I guess if you ask teams, would you rather have 1 Super Bowl ring and never have one ever again? They probably all say yes. But Tampa Bay is looking at starting Baker Mayfield now next season. And Los Angeles, if they don't see the giant red lights blinking over Matt Stafford's head already, and I don't know what their draft situation is, but it's not like they're swimming in capital because of the way that they build their team in a very unique way. And I've always been curious to see when that hits a point of contention where the Rams just have decided first-round draft picks are more asset value in a trade than they are actually developing a player. And that worked out, and it got him a Super Bowl ring. But they have no one on the roster to replace Matt Stafford. And I don't see them having that capital in the future. And who's to say that he's going to be effective this year after already missing time last year due to injury? Again, this is all only a Band-Aid. And maybe Sean McVay is okay with that. And, they built this championship team. Jared Goff couldn't lead the way. And so you trade for Matthew Stafford. But then you do run the risk of muddling in wasteland for a long time. And then you think about the fact that you heard these rumblings of Sean McVay potentially retiring. And it's hard to ignore Sean Payton leaving the Saints after that season of a very bad quarterback carousel, to say the least. I think there's more emotions in the Saints situation with Sean Payton and Drew Brees, where, again, I think this is somewhat of a unique case here, but it's all just a mess, to say the least. And I understand that the Saints have made attempts. Like, I'm not here to completely criticize what they've done, but I'm definitely here to scrutinize it a little bit. Patrick Mahomes was literally right there. And New Orleans history has changed entirely. maybe Sean Payton is still here. He's probably still here. And the Saints probably have a lot more postseason success in the last few years than they have. And that relationship with Drew Brees was strong enough to, it would have been, I think, a very surprising move to hear anything about that. And there was a story that, Drew Brees was on a fishing trip with Zach Strief. He came back early. They were in the middle of the draft, and the Saints were a few picks away. And Sean Payton turned around and said, "Hey, if Patrick Mahomes is here, we're taking him." And Drew said, "Okay." And that was in 2017, and he would play until 2020. But the vision was there, but you can't not see Kansas City coming, if that's your guy, you got to get him. You can't expect, oh, no team is going to try to jump me for this quarterback that ended up being one of the best quarterbacks of all time. And it is really hard to swallow that New Orleans was one pick away from that history. And they tried to do it again with Mac Jones, but it was already too late at that point, and Bill Belichick got the best of them. But when you're trying to trade up out of desperation, rather than this might be the quarterback of our future, you see the motivations there are completely different. And I think your evaluations of the players are different as a result. And instead, Saints fans and really fans of football have just suffered through 2 seasons of not good quarterback play, covering a competition of a former number 1 pick who should be less erratic and unpredictable than they are at that point in their career. And in a way that seems to really contrast the philosophy of then head coach Sean Payton versus an undrafted quarterback who plays 6 positions and really none at the same time, probably worst at quarterback and probably should have been converted to a tight end. And the fact that that was even remotely even was the biggest problem of all to me. And then this last season, so now we have, since Drew Brees retired, Jameis Winston, Trevor Siemian, Ian Book, Taysom Hill, Andy Dalton. And you consider the fact that they tried to trade for Deshaun Watson last year. And we're never really going to know what happened with Jameis Winston. And it is very promising that he ended up coming back in a somewhat surprising way on that deal. But losing your job to Andy Dalton, that's not a good sign for a team. And it's just really been nothing short of uninspiring and really hard to watch at times. So the Saints did the first thing they needed to do this offseason, and probably the best choice considering the circumstances, in securing the quarterback of their immediate future, and they did so in Derek Carr. But then they potentially made what I think could end up being the best dark horse move in this year's draft, in moving up in the 4th round to take Jake Haener out of Fresno State. I just keep going back to these other teams and thinking about how other teams have handled the quarterback position and what other teams had such longevity of success at head coach and quarterback, because that's rare. What the Saints and Saints fans had to watch in Drew Brees and Sean Payton is rare. And it's not something that could ever be replaced. Not in a sense that it could never, but in a hypothetical might not ever be replaced. The other comparable relationship I would put up there would be Bill Belichick and Tom Brady. And all things considered, they had a lot more success than the Saints did. Several more Super Bowl titles. But Bill Belichick drafted 12 quarterbacks from 2001 until today after selecting Tom Brady in the 6th round in 2000. So you compare that again to the Saints drafting 4 quarterbacks. Yeah, there's been 5 less years, but 4 quarterbacks, 2 of which were 7th round draft picks. And it's really hard for me to even say Tommy Stevens as a credible name in that quarterback room. But 8 of the 12 players that the Patriots drafted at quarterback were in rounds 3 or higher over those years. And there's nothing wrong with taking a 6th and a 7th round flyer, as long as you haven't been neglecting that position for years and in earlier rounds. And, they drafted Jacoby Brissett and Matt Castle and Mac Jones in the 1st round. But you really, I think, saw them take a stab at looking at the replacement for Tom Brady when they selected Jimmy Garoppolo in the 2nd round of the 2014 draft. And if you ask me, that relationship soured for a lot of reasons, but I can't stop thinking about the fact that Jimmy Garoppolo was drafted, and then someone tried to trade for him. Bill Belichick tried to hold on to him. And I think Tom Brady saw the writing on the wall. And again, that's Tom Brady. If it can happen to Peyton Manning, it can happen to Tom Brady, it can happen to anyone, and it probably should happen to them. And that's not to say that it's been butterflies and rainbows for them. So I actually was just thinking, because the Patriots, my part 3 of that series was kind of a roundtable on modern examples. One of them being the Chargers that I brought up earlier. You could argue a lot of football is opportunity and luck. A lot of it is luck. And the whole Tyrod Taylor lung puncture situation where they saw what they had in Justin Herbert, I don't think anyone was expecting that. But they still started him, and Phillip Rivers ended up retiring, who pushed out Drew Brees just before that. But the Patriots, they lost Tom Brady, and they tried to replace him with Cam Newton. And Cam Newton was past his prime, and it just did not go well, to say the least. So they did the right thing, and they took a quarterback in the first round the following year. Now, could Bailey Zappi end up being the starting quarterback for them? Entirely possible, because they've taken the time to draft enough quarterbacks where you at least feel like they can tell what's worth developing and what's not worth developing. And really, this last Saturday was the first time that the New Orleans Saints looked to be doing that same thing in a really credible manner. And what they get in Jake Haener, in contrast to someone like Trey Lance, who started 19 total games in college in the FCS subdivision, which is a lower division than FBS. That's a whole other, college football mess topic. But Haener played in 29 games just at Fresno State in 3 years, which he had transferred over from Washington. And he only missed, I believe, 3 or so games his final year due to an ankle injury. But in the meantime, threw 731 completions, completed over 68% of his passes, threw for over 1,000 yards, threw 67 touchdowns and 17 interceptions, and rushed in 8 at his time there. But then really, when you look at his senior year ratio, threw 20 touchdowns and only threw 3 interceptions. That shows not only good decision-making, but growth in doing so. And that's one hell of a ratio to have in a quarterback. And he's not necessarily Brock Purdy, but Haener definitely has a lot more experience in a credible enough conference than someone like Trey Lance. And that's without getting into the absurd draft capital that San Francisco invested in that pick at this point. But then you consider the fact that, yeah, he was the final pick, but they also took Brock Purdy, and it doesn't seem like it was a throwaway. Just hearing how the defense described him over the offseason, hearing how he picked up the playbook, I can't believe I'm saying this, because I've been taught to grow up the exact opposite, and because the Saints and the 49ers used to be in the same division. But I like Kyle Shanahan, and I don't think he gets enough credit as a head coach for the success he's been able to bring to an organization, really, while missing that piece at quarterback. Jimmy Garoppolo was a good quarterback, but he's not in that caliber of the elite ones, which are easier to come, not easy to come by. But he's been one of the coaches that's been able to build that roster around them. And you get the sense that they didn't just throw something at a dartboard and take Brock Purdy. And it really worked out in their favor, considering they might have the worst injury bug of all in the NFL ever since they went to that cursed Greenbrier or whatever it's called, where that season took half their entire team with them. But this tangent is in line with this never-ending circling of a drain that happens to these teams when it comes to landing on a franchise quarterback. And really, Saints fans, at least from my perspective, it's taught me to be a little more appreciative, I guess, of not realizing how valuable Drew Brees was until he was gone. And I know that sounds insane to say, but it's all the little things. And it's just been this complete loss of an identity on offense that Sean Payton couldn't bring the magic back, and really none of the magic was brought back last season. There's no guarantee. And sometimes trading for a free agent quarterback works out, like the cases I mentioned earlier. But when we're talking about building a team and a franchise for long-term stable success, the Saints aren't one quarterback away from the Super Bowl in the way of those teams described in Tampa Bay and Los Angeles Rams. And if you're not primed for the Super Bowl. And even if you are, the only way to escape this circle is to keep drafting and developing quarterbacks. And we just haven't seen that happen whatsoever in New Orleans. And I think you can really see the vision there with Jake Haener. He wasn't at North Dakota State like Trey Lance, but he wasn't exactly behind a Power 5 offensive line either, none of which were drafted or even really mentioned in this year's class. But he was at the Senior Bowl, and so were Saints quarterback coach Ron Curry and offensive assistant DJ Williams, who were coaches on the national team with Jake Haener. And that's really where the value lies in those Senior Bowl practices. Yeah, you won MVP in the game, but that game is a complete wash. It's literally a bunch of guys who have never played football together in their life, snapping the ball to each other, trying to get the timing down. The fact that the game even works at all is surprising to me. That all being said, it's that time in between reps on the field, seeing how a quarterback commands a huddle. That's where you really find what I think are those diamonds in the rough worth looking at in the Senior Bowl. And then you compare that, again, to Ian Book, whose traits in the Senior Bowl were mostly running around trying to get away from Peyton Turner, ironically. So you have a player now who is drafted by a team whose offensive staff members were on staff at the Senior Bowl, who had that time down there. Jeff Ireland took the trip down there. They really spent a lot of time down there at the Senior Bowl. I also saw Dennis Allen at some point. Jake has mentioned that he's received 40 or 45 installs from his team visit before the draft. And you realize that that's now building on top of the coaching and insight that he got from coaches Ron Curry and DJ Williams before getting those installs in the first place. So in terms of being prepared for the assignment, Jake Haener is pretty good as is. Then you add on the fact that his mentor, who played quarterback at his alma mater, is a current quarterback of the New Orleans Saints, and the player that he idolized growing up and chose to emulate very smartly at that was probably the most cerebral player I think of when I think of who plays this sport so well, and that's Drew Brees. And in the limited time that I've been able to see Jake Haener up close with my eyes, you can see the comparison there. And who's the only quarterback I can honestly think of whatsoever, except for the ones handing him off to Tajay in the American team practice. It was not a standout year for quarterbacks, but you did hear a lot of quiet buzz about Jake Haener. And what we saw on Saturday, I think that Senior Bowl time is a little more valuable. Still not a game setting, but it's very limited, about 30 minutes or so, and no 7-on-7, 11-on-11 or anything. And I'll admit, I'm very much more of a defensive minded person. Where I've started scouting, I played defense as a soccer player, and just where my mind lies. So admittedly, I can't say I truly know how to scout quarterback, but I just remember looking at the quarterbacks in Mobile the year prior, and Kenny Pickett so obviously standing out to me, really for nothing more than his presence on the field. He had that moxie, that X factor about him, and both had the initiative and the ability to command a huddle of, again, a huddle of strangers on a week-long limited time team. And Haener had that same poise on Saturday. Even in his huddles with the receivers, you could just tell that he was already feeling like he was in command and not just a character playing a role, for lack of a better phrase. I was just wandering around the field, talking with people, and we saw that Jake Haener was working with Ron Curry and the other quarterback, who I feel really bad, I can't think of the last name, I believe is Frost, because really paled in comparison to what we saw from Haener. But I figured, all right, I'll go watch that. I'm curious about that, because remembering that Ron Curry was one of those Senior Bowl coaches, let's kind of see how that relationship is building. The first drill, I drew out a very sad picture of it. There was those 5 bags laid out spaced on the floor, and Jake was navigating in throughout them, and Ron Curry had some structured version of a pool noodle. I say pool noodle because Tulane quite literally uses pool noodles, but it was a little more fancy than that. But, pressure in his face, pressure in the pocket collapsing. How do you navigate? And what we saw from Jake Haener was very crisp deliberate footwork. And you could see that vision of having the lateral agility to move around in the pocket. It's not always about straight line speed and mobile quarterbacks. And that's not what we're talking about here. But you also need a guy in today's pass rush that the pocket collapses. They have the ability to evade that a little bit, or just be able to climb the pocket and really have that pocket presence. And the way that Jake Haener's fundamentals stayed with all of these changes in his footwork, with all of the distractions, having his eyes laser focused in front of him, it all just looked super easy for him the entire time. And he garnered basically the attention of every media member there, especially when he got onto his throwing drills. Again, absent of any coverage or pass rush of any sort. But the same could be said for a lot of the quarterback competition we watched in 2021, where seasoned quarterbacks in Taysom Hill and Jameis Winston could not make throws on a consistent basis day in and day out. And I would say Jake Haener might have missed like one or two throws. Just his ball placement was there. He can throw with accuracy, precision, and it just, again, it looked easy while he was doing it. But what stuck out to me the most was his touch on his short throws. Alvin Kamara was essentially eliminated from the passing game last season, and it's not really clear why exactly that was. But what was clear during that training camp, that offseason, and the reason I don't really talk that much about last off seasons is because, again, to my point about them swinging and missing for Deshaun Watson and the fact that Andy Dalton ended up playing quarterback for the Saints last year, it's hard to think anything really meaningful came away from that evaluation last offseason. But the year prior to that, there was no touch being thrown on the football whatsoever. And if I actually remember correctly, that was one of the things that Andy Dalton could do better being a veteran quarterback, was just complete short, easy throws that get an offense moving down the field. That was something that Winston struggled with. And I don't think Hill was really capable of applying touch. He just threw fastball darts every single time. And there was really no fixing that, to be honest with you. But Haener was lobbing these softballs that over and over, these receivers who, again, are all rookies when you consider that too. Because when I'm talking about Taysom Hill and Jameis Winston and all of them, I'm talking about receivers that have worked with them previously and have played in the NFL before. These were all rookies out there. And they were catching every ball in stride really without missing a beat, because Jake Haener made them all look good. I won't say look better because I don't know enough about each rookie to say that for sure, but it starts and ends with the quarterback. And when everyone's looking good like that in rookie minicamp, that's a highly valued trait to look at, even if it's in limited action in terms of viewing and without much context, being that it wasn't a game setting. But for the first time since I've been a media member that has gone to Saints training camp, was actually intrigued and curious about a new player under center. One who I think is really quick on his feet and is just sharp in his fundamentals, his timing, and what we could see in the few drills that we saw, they did have receivers running route trees, so he had to make choices, and his decision-making was there, and he could hit all over the route tree. And the last thing that stuck out to me was how short his release is. It's Brady-esque in that manner, but he just had that poise, and you never really thought about his height at all the entire day. I wasn't sure, where rookie minicamp would take me. And accordingly, this episode, as I kind of had planned to break it down, and at first I was a little stressed, for lack of a better term, because we didn't really get to see much. But now 2 days have gone by, and I can't stop thinking about Jake Haener. And if you caught my interview that I did in my last episode of the show with former Tulane quarterback Sean King, we discussed issues with quarterback development and what's going on with rookies and teams that can't seem to turn them into starting players the way that it used to be, just this turnover over and over. A lot of the time it's poor scheme fit. When you're going first or second overall, usually not going to a great team with a good offensive line situation. And you see those messy situations sometimes, but sometimes it's waiting to pull the trigger for too long. Like Trey Lance, there's going to be a point where he has to get on the field and get snaps because he's not getting any better improving his game on the sideline at this point. And we discussed Anthony Richardson in this most recent draft. It's better for him to go out there and get his feet wet, make the mistakes, and get that time under center, because he's lacking in that experience in college. Jake Haener has that credible starting experience. And I think you could say that he can afford to be developed on a slower timeline and really be looking at this as a potential long-term plan here. Because again, if we're following Bill Walsh, it's better to get rid of a player a year too early than a year too late. The reason I started with the outs of Derek Carr's contract, again, was nothing towards negatives on Carr, but what if Jake Haener works out? Because if that's the case, the Saints would be better to do what they didn't do in the case of Drew Brees and take that out and move forward with Jake Haener, should that be the case. But what's most important is the fact that they actually have a chance at a do-over, and that's super rare. And it's something I think that Dennis Allen deserves spotlight for. It's not easy to step into the shoes of someone like Sean Payton and what he did for a franchise and a city. It's just so unique in this experience here. And he's doing so without the quarterback that kept the glue together under Sean Payton for 15 years. So maybe our expectations last year weren't fair. As I remember all of the media, we did a roundtable, and I think it was this idea of continuity, and there were a lot of injuries, and who's to say how things would have gone with a different quarterback playing if Marshawn Lattimore doesn't lacerate a kidney, but it just felt like there were growing pains they were never going to get over last year. And just the fact that they took such a big swing at a quarterback they ultimately didn't get, and then they call Jameis Winston as he's getting on a flight to Indianapolis. There's just no intention going on there. And with someone like Drew Brees, you have to pay a little more attention sooner. But now they have Derek Carr, and he is a credible, surefire option for several years. So I think the team would really do well to seriously look at developing Jake Haener, because Drew Brees, if he can emulate even just a few of his traits, to me, his floor at that point is a high caliber backup. But he really is just the most credible player they have actually taken at quarterback since Drew Brees, in free agency, not in the draft, but just the magnitude of that statement. Because again, it's not as if Jake Haener is Joe Burrow here, but we're talking about a guy that posted a picture on Twitter when he was 10 years old wearing a cape and the jersey of a player who he is looking like the best rookie to eventually take the reins over for, just to show how much time has gone by and how 4 quarterbacks in that amount of time in the draft is just not enough. So I'm intrigued now. And even if he doesn't develop past that backup role, it's fitting in a way that it would end up being Jake Haener, again, with his mentor being the current quarterback and his idol being the former quarterback who brought all the magic to the city of New Orleans. But it's enough to get me actually fascinated in training camp this offseason. And that alone to me is huge, and is why I really wanted to take some time on this, because I wrote this 3-part series. I've been watching it play out in real time, and it has not been a fun story to follow along with. So I am really looking forward now to seeing how this team goes about developing a quarterback room, because this to me is really where Dennis Allen makes his mark. And I think that he's made really strong choices this offseason and is setting up an identity, I think, for himself and this team, even though he's a defensive-minded coach. Something to be said about the fact that that is where he comes from, and yet he knew that this was the year to take another quarterback. So we'll see how this all goes, but that's really all I have for Before the Whistle, because that's where we're at in this stage of the offseason, is before the whistle. So really we weren't any happening in rookie minicamp, and we'll have vet minicamp and everything coming up, but yeah, that's really all I have to say today, is teams draft quarterbacks and then draft them again and then draft another one. Take one in the 4th round, take one in the 7th round. Sure, you could sign one in free agency, but take one in the draft the next round. Take another one the year after that. I'm surprised we don't see more teams take flyers in the 6th and 7th round at quarterback. But then I also wonder how many teams really feel confident that they're able to develop such a fringe player. So this is a discussion that I could literally go on for hours, but I will stop now because I have nothing left to discuss until we see more action. But I am really actually looking forward to this Fresno State quarterback room that has followed me all the way from Northern California, where I also grew up, down here in New Orleans. So that's really all I got, I say, after ranting for 40 minutes on my Monday morning quarterbacking, if you will, that I said I was going to avoid in my first episode of this show. But here we are. But as always, guys, if you do enjoy my tangents, please remember to like and subscribe to Before the Whistle. I have new episodes dropping every Tuesday and Friday on Apple Podcasts. We're now on Spotify, and we are on YouTube as well. I already have my guests lined up for this Friday, and Tulane fans, it's a little lanyap for you guys. But I hope this conversation, I don't want to say gave Saints fans hope, because nothing's guaranteed, and you can take a player number 1 overall and it doesn't work out. And that probably happens as often as it works out. But what you can say is things already feel different than they have the last 2 seasons. It genuinely feels like there is a plan in place to replace Drew Brees, and potentially who's there to replace him with actual credible long-term development going on. And as someone that spends most of my time watching the defensive back and secondary play, that's exciting to me. And it took my eye for the entirety of Saturday's practice. So I look forward to covering this quarterback journey that kind of came out of nowhere. And with that, I'll see y'all on Friday.